town of Maple Hollow rested in a shallow valley between two slow-rolling hills. From a distance, it looked like a place stitched together by memory. White fences, a weather-worn post office, and a single lamppost that hummed softly when the evening wind drifted through. Every night, the same ritual unfolded. Shopkeepers closed their doors, porch lights blinked on one by one, and the scent of rain-touched cedar drifted through the streets. The town was small enough that everyone recognized each other by the sound of their footsteps. People didn't lock their doors out of fear. They simply trusted the rhythm of the place. At the edge of town stood the Hollow Diner, a narrow building with fogged-up windows and a bell that rang too loudly whenever someone entered. Most nights, you'd find Helen Davis behind the counter, silver hair pinned tight, smile faint but kind. She'd pour coffee, ask about your day, and know exactly when to refill your cup without a word being spoken. Across from her usual seat sat Thomas Reed, the town's quiet mailman. Thomas had delivered letters here for 20 years. He spoke softly, as if each word had to be carried carefully, the way he handled envelopes marked fragile. Every evening after his shift, he would sit by the window, coffee untouched, watching the lamppost outside flicker against the fog. Maple Hollow wasn't famous for anything. It didn't appear on maps unless you zoomed in very closely. But it had a heartbeat, the kind you could hear in the hush between rainfall and the sigh of the trees. That was before the night of the blackout. It happened in late September, when summer still clung to the air, but autumn was waiting just beyond the trees. The rain started early that evening, fine and steady. By nightfall, the valley was blanketed in mist. Most of the town had gone to bed when the lights flickered once, then went out entirely. Helen lit candles in the diner, their glow painting warm circles on the counter. Thomas, still seated by the window, watched as darkness folded over the streets like a quiet tide. "Power lines again?" Helen murmured. He nodded. "Same as last year." "Nothing to worry about." They both listened to the rain for a while. Outside, water dripped from the roof in a steady rhythm. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once and fell silent. Then, faintly, from beyond the diner's windows, came the sound of a car door closing. By morning, the lights were back, and Maple Hollow looked almost the same. But the peace had shifted slightly, like the air after a dream you can't quite remember. The post office opened as usual, though Thomas arrived later than normal. Helen noticed the tired look in his eyes when he came in for breakfast. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. He smiled weakly. "Heard something strange last night. Thought it was just a storm outside." The lamppost still hummed, but beneath that sound was something softer. A feeling, not a noise. An unease that no one could name. That day passed quietly, and the next, and the next. But by the end of the week, someone had gone missing. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She lived 2 streets down from the diner, in a blue-painted house with a garden that always smelled of mint and jasmine. She worked part-time at the library and walked everywhere with a small leather notebook pressed against her chest. People said she had an old soul, the kind that saw poetry in ordinary things. On the morning she disappeared, the librarian found her handbag near the steps, dry, untouched by the rain that had fallen overnight. Inside was everything: wallet, keys, the little notebook she never left behind. At first, no one panicked. Maple Hollow was safe. People took day trips without warning. Maybe she'd gone to visit family, someone said. Maybe she needed time to think. But by the second night, when the porch light at Clara's house stayed off, a quiet worry settled over the town like fog. Helen kept the diner open later, serving coffee to the volunteers who searched the nearby woods. Thomas delivered letters with extra care, placing them gently into mailboxes as if afraid of breaking the silence that followed him everywhere. That weekend, the local sheriff, a patient man named Eli Hawthorne, called for calm. He set up a search post in the community hall and asked neighbors to check sheds, barns, and riverbanks. Rain kept falling. The lamppost outside the diner flickered again. One evening, Helen found Thomas sitting there long after closing time, coat still damp, eyes distant. "Any news?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "They found tire tracks near the bridge. Could be hers, or anyone's." She poured him another cup of coffee and watched as the candle flame wavered in the draught. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how a place so small can hold so many secrets." The search continued for 3 more days. Then, on the 4th, when the rain finally stopped, Sheriff Hawthorne came into the diner. His coat was muddy, his face pale but calm. "They found her," he said softly. The words settled in the air like dust. No one spoke for a moment. Helen placed a hand over her apron pocket as if to still her heartbeat. Thomas set down his cup carefully, the clink of porcelain, the only sound in the room. "She's gone?" Helen whispered. Eli nodded once. "Down by the river? Looks like an accident, but we'll know more soon." That night the town didn't sleep. Porch lights stayed on, windows glowed faintly behind curtains, and the rain began again, light, steady, endless. Thomas walked home past the river path where willows leaned over the water. He paused by the bridge and listened to the current move beneath. The moon shimmered faintly on the surface, and for a moment it looked as if the whole valley was breathing. He thought of Clara's notebook, of her neat handwriting and quiet smile, of the things people leave behind when they vanish. Then he turned toward home, his footsteps slow, each one echoing against the hollow night. Morning came to Maple Hollow like a held breath finally released. Mist drifted above the river where they had found Clara, and the early sun broke it into thin gold ribbons that touched the roofs of the little town. From the diner window, Helen could see Sheriff Eli Hawthorne's truck parked by the bridge. The sight of it brought a hush even to the clatter of breakfast plates. Inside the hollow diner, the regulars spoke in half sentences. No one wanted to fill the air with the wrong kind of noise. Helen brewed the day's first pot of coffee, the smell curling upward like comfort, and carried a cup outside for the sheriff. He stood near the railing, notebook open, head bowed toward the rippling water. "Thought you could use this," she said. He smiled faintly. "Thanks, Helen." "Been out here since dawn." They watched the river together, saying nothing for a while. The water didn't look dangerous, slow and clear, with pale stones glinting underneath. But everyone knew how strong the current could be after rain. Finally, Eli said, "I don't think it was an accident. There are tire marks near the far bend, and footprints. 2 sets." Helen listened quietly. The words didn't frighten her. They simply settled somewhere deep beside the rhythm of her heartbeat. "You'll find out," she said softly. "You always do." Across town, Thomas sorted letters with unusual care. The post office smelled of paper and dust, the steady shuffle of envelopes, usually calmed him. But this morning, every name and address carried weight. Each envelope was a small piece of someone's life, and for the first time he realized how fragile those lives were. When he stepped outside to deliver the morning route, the streets were still damp. Curtains fluttered as he passed. People nodded at him, eyes shadowed with the same quiet question. Why her? He stopped at Clara's blue house. A strip of police tape sagged across the gate, moving slightly in the breeze. The garden, once so neatly tended, was littered with petals washed loose by rain. On the porch rail hung a wind chime, its faint notes trembling in the air. Thomas stood there a long moment, then placed the day's mail gently on the step. No one would collect it. Not yet. That afternoon, Sheriff Eli called a meeting in the community hall. Half the town came, shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, each sitting in neat rows of folding chairs. The building smelled of varnish and damp wool. Eli spoke plainly. Clara Whitmore's car was found by the South Bridge. The evidence suggests she wasn't alone. We'll be interviewing everyone who saw her on Friday night. He paused, looking out at the familiar faces. I know this town. We take care of one another. So if any of you noticed anything, no matter how small, come forward. We're not here to accuse. We're here to understand. A murmur passed through the room, soft as the shifting of leaves. No one met anyone's eyes for long. When the meeting ended, Helen found Thomas lingering by the doorway. You'll talk to him? She asked. He nodded slowly. I will. I saw her that night, walking toward the library after sunset. I offered her a ride, but she said she wanted the air. Helen laid a hand on his arm. Then you did right by her. Evening returned gently, wrapping Maple Hollow in its familiar hush. The lamppost outside the diner flickered on, steady this time, its glow spilling across the wet pavement. Inside, Helen cleaned tables, her motions unhurried. Thomas sat at his usual place, staring into the reflection of candlelight on his coffee. Eli thinks whoever was with her knew the town well, Thomas said quietly. Helen glanced up. Then it's someone we know. Maybe. He traced the rim of his cup. Or maybe it's someone who knows us, and that's not the same thing. The thought lingered between them, gentle but heavy. Days turned into a week. The investigation unfolded like a slow tide, one conversation at a time, one quiet revelation after another. Nothing shocking, nothing rushed. Just the steady uncovering of small truths that, when laid together, began to form a picture. Eli discovered that Clara had been tutoring a local teenager in the evenings, a boy named Jacob Morrow. He lived with his uncle on the edge of town. People said Jacob was polite but withdrawn, a boy who preferred the company of books and rivers. When the sheriff spoke with him, Jacob seemed startled but calm. She was kind, he said, always asked about my drawings. I walked her part way home that night, but she told me to turn back once we reached the bridge. Did you see anyone else? Eli asked. Jacob shook his head. Only headlights, far off. Then the rain started again. Eli thanked him and made a note. He believed the boy. Still, something about the headlights tugged at him, a loose thread he couldn't quite place. Back at the diner, Helen noticed that the townspeople had begun speaking in softer tones, as though words themselves might disturb the quiet balance of things. Even the jukebox remained silent. One night, as thunder murmured far away, a stranger entered the diner. He was tall, his coat wet from the rain, his expression unreadable. Coffee, please, he said. His voice carried an accent Helen couldn't place. Somewhere coastal, maybe northern. When she brought his cup, he nodded toward the bulletin board near the counter. On it hung a small notice. In memory of Clara Whitmore. She was a friend of yours? He asked. Helen hesitated. A friend to everyone, really. He stared at the notice for a long time, then said quietly, I passed through here once years ago. Didn't think I'd see this town again. Thomas, sitting nearby, looked up. You've been here before? Briefly, the man replied. I do repair work. Electrical. Fixed a few lines after a storm. The words hung there, simple and casual, yet something in Thomas's chest stirred, a faint echo of that blackout night. When the stranger left, the bell above the door rang twice, then stilled. Helen watched through the fogged glass as he walked down the street and disappeared into the rain. Thomas sat back slowly, thinking of the car door he'd heard that night, the one sound that hadn't fit the rhythm of the storm. He didn't speak of it yet. He only whispered. The rain returned to Maple Hollow as if it had never left. It came softly at first, a hush over the rooftops, a silver veil across the meadows. In the distance, thunder grumbled low and slow, like a memory trying to speak. Sheriff Eli sat in his office long after the lamps had dimmed. Files lay open on the desk, notes arranged neatly in careful rows. Outside the window, the reflection of his own weary face stared back at him. He had seen many cases in his time, but none had settled into the town quite like this one, quietly, deeply, as though the air itself carried the weight of Clara's absence. He lifted his pen and wrote another line. Car tracks, South Bridge. Footprints, 2 sets. Headlights sighted near 9 p.m. Friday. He paused, tapping the pen gently. Headlights. Jacob had mentioned them. So had an old farmer who lived near the bend. Both had described them the same way. Right, close together, the kind used on older pickup trucks. There were only a few trucks in town that matched that description. One belonged to a man named Graham Holt, a repairman who often traveled between Maple Hollow and the nearby towns. The same man who'd appeared in the diner 2 nights ago, quiet and polite, asking for coffee. Eli closed his notebook and rose slowly. The rain on the roof sounded like fingertips drumming in thought. The next morning, Helen opened the diner early as she always did. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and brewing coffee. She turned the open sign to face the street, though few people would be out this early. Thomas came in a few minutes later, mailbag slung over his shoulder. Morning, Helen. Morning, Thomas. You're out before sunrise again? He smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. They didn't speak of the investigation, not directly. The town had fallen into that rhythm of unspoken understanding. Everyone felt the same unease, but no one wanted to disturb the fragile peace. Helen poured him a cup of coffee and said softly, The sheriff was asking about that repairman last night. The one who stopped in for coffee? Thomas looked up. Holt? She nodded. That's the one. He took a slow sip. I remember his face. He looked like someone who didn't belong here, but wanted to. Later that morning, Sheriff Eli drove his old truck down the narrow road toward the edge of town. The wipers brushed away sheets of rain as he followed the line of telephone poles out to a small workshop tucked between the trees. The sign out front read, Graham Holt, Electrical and General Repair. He parked and stepped out, boots crunching on wet gravel. The air smelled of oil and cedar. From inside the shed came the faint sound of a radio. Soft jazz. the kind that plays in lonely hours. Eli knocked twice. Mr. Holt, the music lowered. A moment later, Holt appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. Sheriff, what brings you out in this weather? Just following up on some details. You came into town a few nights ago? That's right. Needed a meal and some dry air. Mind if I ask where you were before that? Holt shrugged. Down by Riverton. Fixing power lines after the storm. Eli nodded, studying the man's eyes. Calm, steady. But behind that calm, something unreadable. Not guilt, but a weight. I understand you knew Clara Whitmore. A pause. The rain filled it. I wouldn't say knew, Holt answered quietly. She hired me last year to fix a heater. That's all. Eli made a small note in his book. And the night she went missing? I was home, Holt said. Long drive from Riverton, bad weather. You can check the logs at the supply station. I signed out at 6. The sheriff nodded again. I'll do that. Appreciate your time. As he turned to leave, he noticed something on a nearby workbench. A cracked wristwatch, the kind with a thin leather strap. Its glass was fogged with moisture, and faintly scratched across the back was a small engraving. CW. Eli didn't mention it then. He only looked at it for a moment longer than he needed to, then stepped back into the rain. That evening, Maple Hollow's main street glistened beneath the lamplight. The diner windows glowed softly against the drizzle, a beacon of warmth in a town that suddenly felt too large for its people. Helen wiped the counter slowly. The radio played a quiet piano tune, filling the silence between thoughts. Thomas entered, soaked from his route, and sat down heavily. Long day, Helen said. He nodded. The mail's lighter lately. People don't send much when they don't know what to say. She poured him coffee, the sound gentle and steady. Do you ever think, she asked, that some stories stay with a place long after they end? He looked at her, then toward the window, where the rain traced silver threads across the glass. Maybe that's how towns remember, he said, through the silence that follows. The discovery. 2 days later, Sheriff Eli returned to Holt's workshop with a warrant. He brought Deputy Mason, a quiet young man with a steady hand. The rain had stopped. Fog clung low over the trees. Inside, the air smelled of iron and damp wood. Eli walked straight to the workbench. The watch was still there. He lifted it carefully into an evidence bag. Holt stood by the doorway, hands resting on a chair. I told you, Sheriff. I've got nothing to hide. Eli met his gaze. Then you won't mind if we look around. They searched the shed slowly, respectfully. Drawers, shelves, toolboxes. Nothing unusual, until Mason opened a wooden chest near the back wall. Inside were several small items wrapped in cloth. Jewelry, old coins, keepsakes. Among them was a silver locket containing a photograph of Clara Whitmore as a young woman. Holt's shoulders tensed. I found that near the bridge, he said quickly. A few days ago. Thought I'd turn it in. Eli didn't reply. He closed the chest gently. You should have done that sooner. The man looked away, his jaw tight. I didn't want to make things worse. Sometimes, Eli said softly, not saying something makes it worse anyway. Later. That night, the town was quiet again. Helen stood outside the diner after closing, watching the mist rise from the street. Across the road, the church bell tolled softly, once, then twice, echoing through the valley. Thomas joined her, his mailbag empty. Did you hear? He asked. She nodded. Eli's bringing someone in. They stood there a long while, listening to the sound of distant footsteps fading towards the station. "The strange thing," Helen murmured, "is how peaceful the town looks. Like nothing ever happened." Thomas gazed toward the bridge where the mist hung thickest. "Maybe peace isn't the absence of what happened," he said. "Maybe it's the way we learn to hold it." Closing scene for the night. At the station, Sheriff Eli sat alone again, the file open before him. The rain had stopped. Outside, dawn began to pale the sky, and the first birds of morning stirred in the trees. He wrote the final note for the day. Evidence collected. Watch, locket, testimony pending. Then he closed the folder gently. He would question Holt again in the morning, but for now, Maple Hollow could rest, just for a few quiet hours, under the hush of dawn. And somewhere beyond the hills, the river whispered on, carrying with it the memory of all that had been lost, and the faint, forgiving hope of what might still be found. The last light in Maple Hollow, the truth in the river. The fog never fully left the valley that morning. It drifted above the river in pale ribbons, winding through the reeds and curling against the stone bridge where everything had changed. The town was still half asleep, windows lit in patches, roosters calling from distant barns. Yet inside the sheriff's office, Eli Hawthorne was already awake. He sat with the same cup of coffee gone cold, reading the same page for the third time. On the desk lay the locket and the watch, each sealed carefully in its envelope. The rain-stained glass of the window mirrored his face. Tired, thoughtful, kind. The door creaked open. Deputy Mason entered quietly. "Morning, Sheriff. Holt's here." Eli nodded, closed the file, and stood. "Let's talk." For his second interview, Graham Holt sat across from him, posture straight, eyes steady but rimmed with the faint red of sleeplessness. The ticking clock filled the silence between their breaths. Eli began gently. "You said you found the locket near the bridge?" "Yes." "After I heard what happened, why keep it?" Holt hesitated. "Because I knew what it meant. She once told me it was a gift from her father. I thought maybe... I don't know. I thought I could fix it. Return it when the time was right." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. There was no defiance in the man's voice, only a quiet guilt that didn't fit the shape of violence. Eli slid a small photograph across the table, an old maintenance log from the power company. "You were on the Riverton job that Friday, but there's a gap. 2 hours unaccounted for between checkout and arrival." Holt exhaled slowly. "There was a storm. I stopped by the river to move a fallen line off the road. That's when I saw her car. And then? She was sitting inside. The engine wasn't running. She looked lost." His voice softened. "I asked if she needed help. She smiled. Said she just wanted to listen to the rain. I told her to be careful near the current. Then I left." He rubbed his hands together as if warming them from some remembered cold. "When I came back through later, the car was empty." Eli didn't press further. He only said, "The watch we found, that belonged to her too." Holt nodded faintly. "She'd taken it off once while we talked. It must have fallen." The sheriff leaned back. Outside, the first rays of sun cut through the fog, thin and gold. "All right, Mr. Holt. I think that's enough for now." 6 word of the interview drifted through town like the scent of rain after harvest. Soft, persistent, and impossible to hold. Helen heard it from a customer at the diner. "They say the repairman's in trouble," whispered Mrs. Langley over her tea. "But the sheriff doesn't think he did it." Helen only nodded, wiping the counter in slow circles. Sometimes trouble isn't about guilt, she murmured. It's about what we carry. Thomas, delivering letters at the next table, looked up. Maybe the truth's smaller than we think. Maybe it's just kindness, misunderstood. That night, Eli returned to the river. He parked by the railing and walked down the muddy path where the footprints had been washed away. The water moved steady and patient, glimmering beneath the half-moon. He knelt near the bank, letting the sounds of night settle around him. The chirp of frogs, the sigh of wind through cattails. It was there, in that quiet, that something shifted in his mind. The slope beside the bridge was steeper than it looked from the road. In the dark, wet ground, a car's tire could slip easily. No need for another hand. He imagined Clara there, sitting in her car, listening to the rain, lost in thoughts that no one else could ever know. Perhaps she'd reached to adjust the radio or stepped out to feel the cool air. One wrong step, one slick patch of earth, and the river would have taken her gently without a sound. Eli felt the ache of that realization. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter. Acceptance, tinged with sorrow. Back at the station, he found Holt waiting outside. "I heard you went back to the bridge," Holt said softly. "I did." Holt's eyes met his. "You saw it, didn't you? The slope, the mud. That night I tried to reach her. I ran down the bank, but she slipped before I could grab her." Eli nodded once. "You tried." "I didn't tell anyone," Holt whispered. "I thought they'd never believe me. I thought silence would be kinder." The sheriff rested a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes silence keeps a wound open. The truth, even when it hurts, lets it breathe." For a long moment, neither spoke. The town clock struck 9 in the distance, its tone soft as forgiveness. The next day dawned clear for the first time in weeks. Mist lifted from the valley, revealing roofs washed clean and fields shining with dew. At the diner, Helen set out fresh flowers on every table. Thomas brought the morning mail, light again, but steady. People talked softly, their voices lighter now, as if the air itself had loosened. Sheriff Eli stopped by for coffee. He didn't speak of the case, and no one asked. The peace in his eyes told them enough. When he finished, he left a few bills on the counter. "Keep the change," he said with a small smile, "for the flowers." Helen watched him leave, then looked through the window toward the bridge glinting in the sunlight. "The town feels different," she said. Thomas nodded. "It remembers more gently now." That evening, as twilight deepened, the lamppost outside the diner flickered once more, steady this time. The river beyond murmured softly, carrying its stories downstream. Maple Hollow slept in peace again, its mystery no longer sharp, only tender, like a dream that had finally found its ending. The last light in Maple Hollow, the confession and the healing. The morning after Graham Holt's quiet confession, Maple Hollow woke to a stillness it hadn't felt in weeks. No sirens, no whispers of what-ifs, only the ordinary sounds of a town remembering how to breathe. The kettle whistling in Helen's diner, the creak of the post office door, the faint hum of bees moving through the thawing fields. Sheriff Eli Hawthorne stepped out of his office and stood on the wooden porch that overlooked Main Street. The air was cool and clear, the kind of air that carried the smell of wet soil and morning bread. He rested his hands on the railing, watching the sunlight spill slowly over the rooftops. There would be paperwork, of course, reports, signatures, statements to close the file. But in his heart, The case was already at rest. Clara Whitmore's death had not been born of cruelty. It had been the tragic meeting of rain, darkness, and a kind heart that stopped to help. Some truths, he thought, arrived not with thunder, but with a sigh. The statement. Inside the station, Holt sat with Deputy Mason, giving his official statement. He spoke quietly, his voice calm, steady, like someone telling a story to ease a burden from his chest. "I'd seen her car by the bridge," he said. "She waved me over. We talked about nothing much, the storm, the road. She seemed tired but peaceful. Then she said she wanted to listen to the water a while." He paused, eyes unfocused. "I turned to get my flashlight from the truck. When I looked back, she was gone. I climbed down the bank, but the mud gave way. I saw the current take her coat, and then nothing." Mason listened without interruption. When Holt finished, he signed the page with a slow, deliberate hand. "Thank you," Mason said softly. "You've done right by her now." Holt gave a small nod. "I hope so." "I just didn't want her story to end as a question." By afternoon, word had spread that the sheriff had closed the case. People came and went quietly through the diner, leaving their coins on the counter and speaking in gentle tones. The tension that had knotted the air for so long began to dissolve, like frost under morning light. Helen placed a vase of lilacs on the window table, the same table where Clara had once sat, sketching letters and drinking tea on sunny days. The blossoms swayed softly whenever someone opened the door. Thomas entered just before noon, hat in hand. "Got a letter for you," he said, placing an envelope on the counter. Helen looked at the handwriting. It was neat, careful, unfamiliar. She opened it slowly. "To the people of Maple Hollow, thank you for your kindness. Clara always said this town held the gentlest hearts she'd ever known. I believe her now. May her memory remind us all to listen, to the rain, to each other, to the quiet places that still hold her laughter. Her brother, Samuel Whitmore." Helen read it twice before setting it down. "Would you put this on the bulletin board, Thomas?" she asked, "where everyone can see it?" He pinned it beside the little notice that still read, "In memory of Clara Whitmore." Beneath the paper, someone had placed a single river stone, smooth and white, like a token of calm. Days passed. The rhythm of Maple Hollow returned, steady as a clock pendulum. Children laughed on the school steps again. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Even the church bell, silent for a time, found its voice one clear Sunday morning. At service that week, Pastor Langley spoke only briefly. "Forgiveness," he said, "isn't about forgetting what was lost. It's about remembering it gently." People nodded, some with tears in their eyes, but they smiled too, the kind of smile that carries gratitude beneath its ache. Afterward, Helen and Thomas walked home together, down the quiet lane that led to the river. The air shimmered with the faint hum of cicadas. "Do you ever think she knew how deeply she was loved?" Helen asked. Thomas considered. "I think she did. Some people leave a peace behind them that doesn't fade, even when they go." They stopped at the bridge. The sheriff had repaired the railing, polishing the wood until it gleamed. Wildflowers had begun to grow again along the slope, small purple blossoms nodding in the breeze. Helen leaned against the rail. "Strange how beautiful it looks now." Thomas smiled. "Maybe that's her way of saying thank you." Night came soft and clear. The diner closed early, and Helen lingered a while to clean the counters. The radio played a slow, lilting tune, something old, familiar, Outside, the lamppost cast its warm circle of light across the empty street. Sheriff Eli stopped by on his way home. "Coffee?" she asked. He nodded. They sat without words for a time, listening to the quiet. "She was one of the good ones," Helen said finally. "They all are," Eli replied. "That's what makes this work both heavy and holy." He looked out at the street, at the glow spilling across the rain-damp pavement. "I used to think solving a case meant finding answers. Lately, I think it means finding peace." Helen smiled faintly. "Then you've done both." A week later, the town gathered by the riverbank for a memorial. The morning was bright, the water clear and slow. Pastor Langley read a few words. Children from the school placed flowers on the water's surface, daisies, lilacs, wild roses. Each bloom floated downstream, their colors weaving together like a drifting quilt. Thomas brought a small wooden box. Inside was Clara's locket, polished and repaired. He'd spent his evenings sanding it carefully, then lined the inside with a folded note. "You are remembered." Sheriff Eli placed the box into the current. It bobbed once, twice, then began its gentle journey away from shore. Helen whispered, "May it find her." And for a moment, it felt as though the entire town bowed its head in silent prayer. That night, the rain returned, but softly, like a lullaby. From their homes, the people of Maple Hollow listened to it with new ears. The sound no longer carried fear, but memory. Not sorrow, but grace. In her little house above the diner, Helen brewed tea and sat by the window. She could see the faint outline of the bridge silvered in moonlight. Thomas passed by below, tipping his hat toward her lighted window before continuing home. She smiled. The world, she thought, was stitched together by small kindnesses. Letters, flowers, quiet prayers. And somehow, that was enough. Sheriff Eli, too, sat awake for a while, Lockett's photograph resting on his desk. The case was closed, but its lesson remained. That truth, when told with care, can be its own form of mercy. He closed his eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain. It sounded almost like a heartbeat, slow, patient, alive. By dawn, the clouds broke apart once more. The sun rose over Maple Hollow, touching every rooftop, every blade of grass, every ripple in the river. The town had not forgotten. It had simply learned to remember softly. And in that remembering lay its peace. The last light in Maple Hollow. The season of quiet spring rolled gently into summer, and Maple Hollow moved at the slow rhythm of the wind through the wheat fields. There were still moments, here and there, when people spoke Clara's name. But now it was said softly, as if it belonged to the air itself. The town had changed, though it was hard to say exactly how. Maybe it was in the way the shopkeepers left their doors open longer to let the sunlight in, or how people paused a little more often to listen. Really listen. When someone spoke, no one rushed anymore. The hurried footsteps, the small-town gossip, even the sharp clang of the church bell had softened somehow. It was as if Maple Hollow had learned the language of silence. Helen began opening her diner earlier in the mornings. She liked the quiet hours before dawn, when the sky was a pale lavender and the smell of rising bread floated down from the bakery next door. She'd light the lamps one by one, wipe down the counter, and watch the light spread across Main Street. Sometimes Thomas would pass by with his mail satchel, whistling a tune so soft it could barely be heard above the rustle of leaves. "Morning, Helen," he'd call, his voice warm as sunlight. "Morning, Thomas." "You're up before the sparrows again," he'd laugh. "Can't let them get all the good worms." They'd share that small exchange, the kind that seems unimportant but somehow holds the shape of comfort. On some days, Helen would leave a cup of coffee on the window ledge for him. She'd watch as he lifted it with a smile and took that first grateful sip before continuing on his route. It became a quiet ritual, a small act of friendship, born from shared memories and healing hearts. Sheriff Eli Hawthorne had started taking long evening walks along the river road. The case had left him weary, but also more thoughtful. He'd always carried the weight of the town's worries, but lately he found himself learning how to set them down, one by one, like stones being placed gently back into the water. He'd stop sometimes by the repaired bridge, running his fingers along the smooth wooden rail. The wildflowers were taller now, their purple heads swaying in the soft wind. On one such evening he met Pastor Langley there. The pastor leaned on his cane, gazing out at the silvered current. "She's still here, you know," the old man said. "In the quiet, in the kindness. Maybe that's all the heaven we ever need to find." Eli nodded. "Maybe that's true." They stood together for a long time, saying nothing more. One late afternoon, as the sky glowed with the golden warmth of early summer, Thomas arrived at the diner holding a new envelope, the same careful handwriting as before. Helen opened it at the counter while he poured himself a cup of coffee. "Dear friends, I've come to think often of your town. The kindness you showed my sister has not been forgotten. I'll be visiting soon, not to mourn, but to thank you in person. I'd like to see the bridge, if I may. With gratitude, Samuel Whitmore." Helen smiled as she read the letter aloud. "He's coming home," she said softly. Thomas nodded. "Feels right." Like a story finishing its circle, they decided together that when he arrived, the town would welcome him, not with sadness, but with music and supper. A simple evening to share stories and remember the good. A week later, on a mild evening, touched with orange light, the people of Maple Hollow gathered at Helen's diner. The tables were moved together, the windows thrown wide to let in the breeze. Children ran barefoot outside while their parents laughed and shared old tales. The sound of a fiddle drifted from the porch, slow and tender, like an echo of something familiar. When Samuel Whitmore finally arrived, he stood for a long moment on the threshold, taking in the sight, the warmth, the laughter, the faces that had once been strangers but now felt like family. He spoke gently. "Thank you, all of you, for giving her peace." Helen placed a hand over his. "She gave it to us first." After supper, the townsfolk walked together to the riverbank. Fireflies glimmered in the tall grass, blinking like tiny lanterns in the dimming light. Samuel stepped to the center of the bridge. He took from his pocket a small folded paper and dropped it into the slow-moving current. It floated gently downstream, its edges catching the moonlight. "What did it say?" Thomas asked softly. Samuel smiled. "Just her name. Nothing more. The river already knows the rest." The people watched in silence as the paper drifted away, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a glimmer among the ripples. When the last fireflies dimmed and the air cooled with the promise of night, everyone returned home. The streets glowed faintly under the lamplight. A hush settled over Maple Hollow. Not the hush of emptiness, but of peace. Helen sat once more by her window, tea in hand. The radio hummed a slow melody and she smiled to herself. She thought of all that had changed. The bridge mended, the town softened, the hearts opened again to the world. In her heart, she whispered a quiet thank you to Clara, to the rain, to time itself for teaching them how to rest gently in what remains. And so Maple Hollow entered its season of quiet. A place that had once trembled with loss now breathed in rhythm with the river, steady and kind. Somewhere in the night, a single light burned in the diner window, warm and unwavering. The last light in Maple Hollow, and it was enough. The last light in Maple Hollow. The reflection years have passed since the spring when Maple Hollow changed. The town still stands much as it did. A handful of streets lined with elm trees, the faint chime of a bell from the church, the soft clatter of dishes in Helen's diner each morning. If you were to walk through it now, you might not notice anything remarkable at first. Children still ride their bicycles down the lane. The river still hums its steady tune beneath the bridge. But if you stayed a while, if you slowed your step and listened closely, you might feel it. That quiet, that peace, the kind that only grows after sorrow has been gently understood. Helen still runs her diner, though her hair has turned silver at the edges. Every morning, she lights a candle by the window before the sun rises. Not for sadness, just as a way of keeping warmth in the world. Sometimes travelers stop by, drawn by the little sign that reads, "Homemade Pie and Quiet Company." They ask about the bridge, the river, the story that everyone in town seems to know, but never tells quite the same way. And Helen smiles that small, peaceful smile of hers. She'll say only, "There was once a girl who loved the sound of rain, and because of her, we all learned to listen." Then she pours them coffee and lets the silence do the rest. Sheriff Eli retired long ago. He built a small cabin by the edge of the river, where he tends a garden that hums with bees and lavender. Some evenings he sits on the porch, listening to the same current that once carried so many of his thoughts away. He no longer wonders why things happened the way they did. He just listens, and somehow that feels like understanding. He once wrote in a letter to Pastor Langley, "Peace isn't the absence of answers. It's the presence of quiet that stays after you've stopped searching." The letter hangs framed on the wall of the church now, next to a simple cross made of riverwood. Thomas and the River Thomas still walks his old mail route, though slower now, his hat a little more worn, his steps a little more measured. He still whistles as he goes, the same tune he used to hum when he'd greet Helen each morning. Sometimes at the bridge, he pauses to drop a small pebble into the water. "Morning, Clara," he whispers. The ripple spreads and fades, and he smiles, as though the river whispered back. He says that's what keeps him young, talking to the quiet and believing it listens. Maple Hollow never grew much larger, never became famous for anything at all. It remained a little dot on the map, a place people passed through on their way somewhere else. But those who stopped, even for a night, often left feeling lighter, calmer, somehow more at ease. They couldn't always explain why. Maybe it was the smell of lilacs by the diner door. Maybe it was the sound of the river whispering through the trees. Or maybe it was something you can't quite name. A stillness that seeps into you. A reminder that not all stories end in grief. Some just settle into peace. Sometimes, when I think of Maple Hollow, I imagine that light in the diner window. The one that never quite goes out. I imagine Helen leaning against the counter, her eyes reflecting that soft golden glow. I imagine the bridge standing strong against the dusk, wildflowers brushing against its rail, their petals trembling with the hush of evening air. And I think about Clara Whitmore, the woman who loved the rain, how her presence lingered, not as tragedy, but as tenderness. The world often moves too fast to remember such people. But in small places, quiet places, the heart still keeps them. Gently, faithfully. If you listen closely tonight, really listen, you might hear it